one of the best questions I ask people is, and I'll ask you, Candice, who is your sexual role model?
Oh man, I don't know if I've ever even thought of that. Sexual role model. You know what? I'm gonna say, and she's just one of my role models in general is probably Esther Perel,
Hmm.
because she's like this older woman that's still very vivacious, and you can tell like she has this amazing sexual relationship with her husband still. Like it is, she's constantly talking about passion and how do you keep that spark alive. And I think so often and it's so sad, we hear, if you've been married for so long that just fizzles and it snuffs out, or at a certain age you have to just accept that death of your sexuality. And she's like a living reminder that that's not the case. So yeah, I'd have to say her.
That's a good one. I know Esther. She's a friend and a colleague. I bet she would be thrilled to hear you say that.
Oh my gosh, yeah,
Um,
she's amazing.
I The thing is, and I will say, women are often more able to answer that question. Guys often aren't, because oftentimes the only time we hear about male sexuality is when a guy's in trouble for it.
Mm,
So
that's
I
really
ask,
sad. Really sad
yeah.
to hear. Yeah.
So I ask people to start thinking about, what kind of sexual being do you want to be? How do you want to integrate your sexuality into your life in an ethical, self determined kind of way? At this point, sorry, you can hear the train going by outside my office. Um, at at this point, as I started thinking about this question years ago, and I realized that I've got lots of sexual role models. And one of my favorites right now is, and this sounds funny, but Miley Cyrus is
Really?
that, yeah, because she I just love the fact that she grew up this kind of Disney girl and has now pushed back and said, I'm going to be the sexual person I want to be. Um, and then a few years ago, she got blackmailed over naked pictures, and people were saying, "Oh, we're going to release these naked pictures if you don't pay us money." And she said, "Fuck you," and she posted them online herself.
That's awesome.
That's that. Yeah, that is hard rock right there. I love it. And what that reflects is a level of self acceptance of your sexuality.
Hmm.
That, I think, when we accept our own sexuality, now we get to start thinking about, how do I consciously make my sexuality a healthy part of my life? And that's a conversation I just love to be part of with patients and people in general. Um, because that's also how we start to make the world a better place. And to be honest, I mean, we all know that sex with somebody who has accepted themselves as a sexual being is the hottest sex ever. Um, that's how I want us all to get there.
Yeah. So, how, when you have these patients that come in, and I can imagine a lot of them are probably like really nervous and squeamish, maybe, and timid around the conversation of creating or like
Hmm.
that sexual life that they want. And especially when it's been drilled in around you, like there is only one path forward. So, to have this idea that there's other options is so crazy to them. Like, how do you start? How do you get them into the water, I guess?
Yeah, starts with lots of questions. Starts with questions about, what are your ideas or your beliefs about sex? Where did that come from? How do you remember being taught that? Where did you learn that? Then I might move to, are you sure that's the only way? Now, as you look back at that lesson that you learned when you were a child, are you sure it's right? Many of us were taught racist and sexist beliefs as young children, right? But most of us these days are actually not racist or all that sexist anymore. We've moved away from those values. So our values can change, and oftentimes our values change as society changes. So between 2010 and 2015, the United States went through the largest shift in social values in recorded human history. In 2010, a majority of the United States believed that gay marriage was wrong. In 2015, a majority of the Americans believed that gay marriage was right. In just 5 years, a huge shift happened. And that shift happened because we had lots of stars, celebrities coming out as gay. We had TV shows, Will and Grace, where gay characters were open and public and were human. And it got safe enough that our friends and our family members started coming out more. And it forced us all to realize that a lot of our judgment around homosexuality was based on stigma and ignorance. The same is true around race. The same is true around all kinds of values. So, access to pornography is actually part of the change that's happening in our society around sexuality. 50 Shades of Grey. I
Mhm.
mean, love the book or hate it, love the movies or hate them. They showed us that there are millions, hundreds of millions of women out there that are actually really interested in the fantasy of being dominated.
Oh, yeah.
And before that, I mean, the sex addiction industry, it's funny, in 2003, one of the, Patrick Carnes, the leader of the sex addiction industry, published a book called Don't Call It Love. And in the book, he said that interest in BDSM was an addiction and that it was an unhealthy relationship with torture. Um, Now, people in the sex addiction industry are saying, well, it can be a healthy outlet. It can be a healthy expression if it's done in healthy ways, right? Good for them that they've gotten there. But we are increasingly accepting sexual diversity and recognizing that having diverse sexual interest doesn't make somebody a bad person, doesn't make them automatically immortal. So we we used to believe that interest in bondage and discipline, that interest in exhibitionism, interest in sadism and masochism, interest in voyeurism, things like that, that these were really rare, and that when they happened, they were usually unhealthy. These are sexual disorders that are diagnosed in the DSM. A couple of years ago in 2016, a researcher in Canada did this study. His name's Christian Joyal, and they did the study three different ways. They called people, they interviewed people, and they did internet surveys. And they found, and these were non-clinical people. These were not people coming to treatment for disturbed sexuality. These were just Joe Schmo. And they found that 50% of the general population has interest in sexual behaviors that we used to think were disordered.
Mm.
30% of people had engaged in them. And interest in masochism or sexual submission was actually correlated with life satisfaction. People that were interested in that were more likely to be satisfied in their life.
Mm-hmm.
So we found out that these the reason we've always thought that hetero monogamy sex was the only healthy kind of sex was because we shamed everything else. We didn't hear about all of those non-vanilla interests because we shamed people if they talked about them. But it turns out that a lot of the people doing the shaming have those interests themselves.
Naturally.
I mean, all the over the past couple of years, I mean, there have been dozens of QAnon people who got caught watching child pornography
Mm.
as they are out there attacking pedophiles and such. And the valuable thing, Joelle did a follow up study to that, and found that people who had sexual interest or fantasies that were criminal or that were non consensual were very unlikely to enact those behaviors. So it's possible to have sexual fantasies that are potentially unhealthy if you act on them.
Mm-hmm.
It's possible to have those fantasies and not act on them.
Mm-hmm.
I had this guy come to me a few years ago, and young kid, 21, maybe something like that, in college. And he'd grown up really, really feminist, deeply believed in feminist values, egalitarianism. Um, but the thing that turned him on the most was videos and fantasies of, pardon my French to your audience, but face fucking a girl until, tears were running down her face. And even better if she had mascara and the mascara was running down her face. He was really guilty and ashamed about that fantasy, though, because he thought it made him a rapist. He thought that made him a bad person having that fantasy because it contrasted his egalitarian beliefs. And I said, dude, your job is to find a feminist who's really into that. And the thing is, there's lots of them because there's lots of feminists who fantasize about, rape fantasies.
Yeah, I was gonna say, isn't that very common for like
Right.
really hardcore feminists to actually be into more of like that aggressive kind of S&M and things like that?
Right. We don't know why people fantasize about the things they fantasize. We don't
Mm-hmm.
know why people find arousing the things they find. We genuinely don't. I mean, it's like a roll of the dice. It's an interaction of your brain, your sexual arousal, and the things you encounter in your environment.
Mm-hmm.
But research around sexual fantasy pretty consistently finds that people are fantasize about the taboo, the things they're not supposed to fantasize about. So, Republicans and conservatives are much more likely to fantasize about cuckolding and infidelity.
And like threesomes, right?
And yeah,
Yeah.
whereas Democrats and progressives are much more likely to fantasize about bondage and discipline and sadomasochism
Mm-hmm.
because the Democrats believe in egalitarianism, and then in BDSM, somebody's in charge and being mean to the other one. Ooh, naughty. And, Republicans, I mean, Jerry Falwell Jr. and Paul Manafort and Roger Stone all have these histories of engaging in sexual behaviors that are not accepted within that kind of traditional conservative Republican culture. Why? Because it's naughty.
Mm-hmm.
It's sexy to fantasize about the thing you're not supposed to do.
Mm-hmm.